former seminary professor of mine was fond of saying, when we pick up the Bible, it does stuff to us and through us. That was his thing, to us and through us. I understood that as his lighthearted way of saying that the Bible's a living document. Sometimes it teaches us, sometimes it convicts us, sometimes it surprises us, sometimes all those things at once. On some days, a certain passage will strike us one way. The next day, that same passage will strike us differently. We might feel unmoved by one passage, but overcome by another. I was thinking of that saying of his today, looking at this collection of passages we have. Each one has sort of different questions and concerns attached to it. From the Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament, we get this ominous message from God through the prophet Amos, declaring that a day of devastation is coming, one in which the people of Israel will experience a famine. But not a famine of bread and drink, a famine of the word of God. The psalm for the day contains some similarly angry themes, deriding those who love evil more than good, those who practice deceit and wickedness against the vulnerable. And the psalmist expresses this longing for God to come and uproot the wicked, right? Restore the righteousness among the people. And then in Colossians, we get a really different image. One of the most beautiful in the Bible, in my personal view. In Jesus, we get the fullness of God. God was pleased to dwell in Jesus, and through him, God has been reconciled to all things in heaven and on earth. So 3 really different passages, and then the gospel, the story of 2 sisters, Mary and Martha, and a disagreement that Jesus steps into involving household chores, right? It feels strange, and it feels a long way off from the big themes of the first 3 readings, right? Sin and death, cosmic victory in Jesus Christ. But maybe not actually. Maybe it's not as far off as it looks at first, because I think beneath this kind of odd exchange between Martha and Jesus is a deeper question. Not just about chores, but about how we respond to the presence of God when we're confronted with it. And that's present in those first 3 readings too. Let me tell you what I mean. I want to acknowledge that some of us might feel some friction or maybe even frustration with the scene in the gospel passage. In the story, a woman named Martha has welcomed Jesus and his disciples into her home. Jesus is teaching. Martha's sister Mary is sitting with the other disciples listening to Jesus. Martha's rushing around, trying to serve as host, taking care of everyone. And the end of the story is Martha getting chided by Jesus for being worried and distracted by many things. Mary is praised for having chosen the better part. Is this story familiar? Do people know this story? You've encountered this before. If you've been in church for a while, you've probably heard it. The contrast drawn between Mary and Martha has sometimes been used to sketch different types of people, or even sometimes different ways of faith, right? And this idea, people like Martha they're type A people, they're doers, achievers, planners, right? And then people like Mary get construed as the flip side of the coin, type B, dreamers, contemplatives, learners. Martha acts while Mary studies. There are a few things to say about this. Here's the first. When Mary and Martha get pitted against one another like this as contrasting types, it gives us the wrong impression about what this story is about. In essence, that Jesus is expressing a preference for the Marys over the Marthas of the world, the dreamers or the contemplatives over the doers. That's not what's happening here. We know how important hospitality is to Jesus as a Christian act. If you were here last week, you heard the story of the parable of the Good Samaritan. In that story, it's a priest and a Levite. Levites are members of the chosen priestly class. Priest and a Levite pass by the person in need on the side of the road before a Gentile comes along and saves the person through an act of hospitality. That story ends, and the very next verse is today's gospel. In other words, Immediately before this, Jesus tells a story about how the educated religious leaders, the people who spend their life in prayer and study, pass by the person in need. And then an outsider comes along and offers hospitality to a person in need. So it can't be that Jesus is professing a preference for a Mary type over a Martha type. It doesn't fit with the rest of what he's doing in his ministry. And heaven knows how much we need the Marthas of the world anyway in the church, right? We need Marthas on vestry. We need Marthas leading coffee hour, volunteering at the yard sale, right? The Marthas of the world help us keep the church moving forward. But here's the second thing to say. We need to understand that this story is showing us Jesus' closeness to both Martha and Mary. Martha has no problem complaining to Jesus and asking for help. She marches into a room with a bunch of people and says, "Jesus, tell my sister to get up and help me." That's not the kind of thing you do with someone that you feel you need to kind of stand on ceremony with, right? If I was hosting, I feel uncomfortable doing that. So I'd imagine that Martha feels pretty comfortable with Jesus. This is an exchange between two people who already have a close relationship. Later on in the book of John, it's the same Martha who comes to Jesus in tears when her brother Lazarus dies. And she says to him, "Lord, if you had been there, my brother would not have died." Whatever Jesus is communicating to Martha needs to be understood in that light. This is not a teacher reprimanding a student. This is a friend speaking to a friend that they know well. Here's the last thing to say. Jesus begins his reply to Martha by saying her name twice, right? Martha, Martha. On the page, it reads as a little bit patronizing. If someone came to me that way, Elliott, I'd be bracing, something unpleasant is coming. But that's not what's going on here. This is one of only 7 times in the whole Bible when God uses a name twice like that in direct address to someone. Each of the other 6 times comes at a profoundly significant moment of calling in which the person is faced with a life-changing message or choice from God. I won't list them all, but we would recognize most of the moments. God speaking to Moses at the burning bush, Saul, later called Paul, on the road to Damascus. They each begin the same way. Moses, Moses. Saul, Saul. God's trying to grab the person's attention in each story and tell them something crucial. And in the other 6 moments, the individuals all leave the encounter of hearing their name twice with a renewed sense of purpose or identity or calling. Is that what Jesus is doing here with Martha? Is he calling to her in an unusual way, trying to get her attention or point her towards something critical? Can't say for sure what Jesus' intent was or how Martha received it, because the story ends right after Jesus' comments and it moves on to the next part of the narrative. We don't get to hear Martha's response. But I am compelled by this idea that in this moment, Jesus is not trying just to settle a dispute between sisters or say that one type of faith is better than the other. I think he's extending a deep invitation to Martha, a call to set down the demands of daily life and attend to the presence of God, which in this case is right there in her living room. Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. Do any of you feel worried and distracted by many things? I do. How can we not be, right, in this day and age? There are so many things to distract us and so many things that deserve worry. So I wonder if that's the heart of what Jesus is trying to express to Martha. Jesus never says that Mary is the better part. He says she has chosen the better part. Even though in the previous passage Jesus has affirmed the very thing that Martha is doing, maybe Jesus sees something here in Martha that's blocking her ability to attend to what's most important, which is that God has drawn close to her. Instead of a rebuke, I read this as an invitation. Maybe Jesus is trying to call Martha's attention towards something critical. And through this passage, maybe ours too.